Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025, and today we're going to talk about correcting poor drainage, a static aerated compost system, and what if my cover crops don't die? It's a good question. So let's do it. All right, happy Wednesday, everyone, and it is freezing in my office after several days of basically non-existent temperatures. Got a nice wool sweater on from that my wife knit, and it is keeping me alive at the moment. I did want to say, just while I'm thinking about it, there is a chance that I don't get a show done tomorrow because I will be running back and forth to the Oak Conference. We will see, though. Never know. But just a heads up, if you don't see a show come up tomorrow, that's why. Anyway, I thought I would use today to catch up on some Patreon questions. I don't want to get too far behind on those as we roll into the growing season over the next couple of months because I am sure that a lot of good questions are going to pop up that need to be addressed with a little more timeliness. So yeah. Let's roll with some Patreon questions. And remember, if you are a Patreon member, don't hesitate to get more questions in. It is truly a service to my poor little brain that needs to come up with topics every day to have those questions handy. Like, I don't know if you've ever had to come lecture for 100 minutes every week on roughly 15 different subjects, but I certainly have moments where I'm like, should I just, talk about my breakfast sandwich this morning for the first segment? So, the more questions, the merrier. Patreon members, the January show thread awaits. All right. Our first question comes from Patreon member Bill Marshall, who writes, quote, in at least one of your YouTube videos, you mention how we, as ecological growers, gardeners, farmers, etc., have a responsibility to protect that ecology both on and off our land. In several other videos, you discuss how you dealt with excess water and its potential for soil erosion, nutrient runoff. If I recall, your practices involve one or more forms of drainage. Can you discuss where that drained water goes? Is there a way to address drainage ecologically? Asking as a home vegetable gardener who sees surface ponding on the lawn. Also, trying to minimize runoff from my composting area. I'm experimenting with a few ideas, but will keep this inquiry as short as I can. Thank you, end quote. All right, great question, Bill. So not all of you live in an area where or are farming on soils where excessive water and drainage are going to be a priority or even a necessity. And some of you in dry climates may even be like, I wouldn't mind a little drainage issue from time to time. For the rest of you, however, I imagine you're listening intently because poor drainage can be absolutely debilitating to a garden and farm. So obviously, in an ideal situation, you select a location for your garden that does not have a drainage issue. In a less than ideal situation where poorly drained soil is pretty much all you've got, like me here on our new farm, addressing the drainage will be essential for productivity. First, you may not know which you have, poorly draining or well draining. And for that, you will need to do a percolation test, which is dig a 12 by 12 inch hole in the growing season when the soil is not super moist or super dry. Fill that hole with water, let it drain, fill that hole again, and if it does not drain within 24 hours, run for your life. Or maybe just pick a different spot, or expect to have to deal with drainage. This percolation test is something I did not do in the beginning of our new farm because, one, it's weird to just dig holes on land you don't own, so there's that. But also the USDA Web Soil Survey listed my farm land as well draining. Great resource, totally wrong on this one. The fact that every one of our neighbors has a pond should have clued me in a little bit, but there's a lot to think about when buying a new farm. Also, just because it is listed as well draining doesn't mean previous land works or soil management didn't change that. There were drain tiles leading right into our garden that we found while installing some drainage around the barn so that our tools weren't always in a puddle. That probably also didn't help having the drain tiles leading right into the garden. So to your question, what I did to improve our drainage in the garden was to point the beds downhill or slightly downhill to release excess water. I had them going across the field in some areas, but the problem was water would build up in the paths and run over the bed, taking the soil and mulch with it. So I shifted the beds so that that would no longer happen. Then I raised them to allow the paths to act as little ditches in heavy downpours, which we are capable of getting 2 or 3 inch downpours at a time in just a few hours, multiple times a year, which is intense. It's not super fun. Like, I'd rather just have, maybe take 1 or 2 of those inches and give them to me in like July and August. Just spitballing. Living pathways do a good job at breaking up that the poor drainage and absorbing some of the excess moisture as well. For me, if I was near a waterway like a river or stream, I would have considered building retention pond. In fact, I built a little retention pond this year, and I'm going to play with that and monitor it and maybe build some other smaller ponds around the farm for biodiversity anyway, and maybe to recapture some of that water. And if our neighbors are any indication, they clearly fit the landscape. But pond building is perhaps for another time. Though I think that that speaks to your part of your question about ecological solutions and about compost. I want to do a whole segment on compost and drainage, because that is a part of starting compost operations, is they do have to think about the drainage and the runoff and the leachate. So that's maybe for its own topic. And I promise, Bill, I will try and get to that as a full topic on its own. What we would absolutely want to avoid is running drainage water into a creek or lake or other natural water system. Permaculturalists might recommend swales, and that's fine. Those can work, but depending on how your land lays, having those ditches that follow the contour of the land through and around your gardens may not be ideal for productivity. Like I've always described our farm as somewhat of a mogul's course, so it's like super bumpy and moundy, and doing stuff on contour would be really quite wavy, so it may not be ideal for what we do. A permaculturalist might also say that the problem is the solution, and perhaps those poorly drained areas are begging to be a pond and or have some wetland plants instead of grass. Again, that doesn't always make sense in a garden, but every land is different, and if it's just your lawn, maybe this isn't so much of a problem as an opportunity. Yeah, maybe you could bring in some plants you haven't thought of that could bring in new wildlife, new ecology. I did not install any drain tile or French drain on any part of our garden except for just like right around our shed. And for the moment, it does not look like I will need to, but to be sure, the poor drainage slows this farm down a bit in the spring. The growth is slower than our last farm by a full 10 days. Our last farm is notably only 15 minutes south of here, but it had great drainage, which was actually excellent in the spring, but it also was somewhat annoying in the summer. By contrast, on the new farm, we see signs of drought much later than most people see them in the area. So although there is still room for improvement in our soil and for our farm, it's come together these last 4 years quite nicely, and the soil gets better every season. For me, I'm glad we didn't do anything too dramatic at first, but I do wish we'd oriented our beds a little bit differently and raised them all better in the beginning to manage the water better. Anyway, that's not super detailed, but hopefully it gives you some idea of what to think about with where to point drainage water. And again, I'll do more on compost and leachate at another time. Our land is weird, and certain parts drain better than others. So I have really had to work hard on this property and on the soil to understand it. They say like farmers' footprints are the best fertilizer. Well, the farmers' footprints can be the best drainage approach. So keep that in mind. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, and of course, more on drainage in time, because there's a lot that could be said about it. Up next, we'll continue on with our Patreon questions about compost in a static pile, BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Harnwah Greenhouses. Harnwah Greenhouses has pioneered controlled environment agriculture since 1965, partnering with market gardeners and farmers across North America to deliver turnkey greenhouse solutions. Their unwavering mission is to support growers' success through innovation and expertise in design, manufacturing, and installation. Harnwah Greenhouses are engineered to withstand high wind and snow loads, providing optimal brightness, increased yields, rapid ROI, and long-lasting durability. With over 20,000 projects completed, they are more than a manufacturer. They are a trusted partner. Their structures foster sustainable, energy-efficient ecosystems that drive profitable, resilient agriculture. In 2025, Harnwah is introducing a new low-tech, high-tunnel model starting at just $2 per square foot, offering open field growers an accessible entry into controlled environment agriculture. Harnwah Greenhouses, leading the way in turnkey solutions for local growers. Learn more at harnwah.com. That's HARNOIS.com. All right, back to the show. A quick reminder that if you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's second Patreon question comes from Patreon member Robert from Fat Bush Farms, who asks, quote, I wanted to ask if you still use that static aerated composter, and if so, how's it going? Let me know. Thanks, end quote. All right, thanks to you, Robert, and I believe I touched on this topic in an earlier episode of the show that I will link in the show notes, but because I believe there are always multiple ways to answer every question, I'll give this another stab from another angle. And don't hesitate to ask questions out of fear of being redundant. Few questions have single answers, and I'm always down to try take a new stab at it. There's always more to add, more contexts to include, etc. So for the uninitiated, static aerated composting is when you build a system, usually fans in a pipe, that pumps small amounts of air into a compost pile to regulate the temperature and to kind of get it started. The fans are notably set on a timer because too much air can stop the pile from heating up, so it'll click on and click off at different intervals. As I discussed in that previous episode, I made that static aerated compost system to primarily comply with organic certification, which it effectively did. In my experience, certifiers are usually cool with your static aerated system as long as it is attempting to meet the basic rules. Honestly, I get the impression organic certifiers don't see a ton of organic composting systems because the rules can be daunting and confusing for farmers and to read on paper. So they just prefer to buy compost in bulk or just skip the composting process or follow the 90-120 day rule. But anyway, that's for a different conversation. My thing with the static aerated compost system is that it's a very simple way to meet organic regulations, but it is not necessarily a great way to make robust compost, free of weed seeds and disease, unless you do a little extra work to kind of help it along. What it can do, however, is inject oxygen into the pile and get it working, maybe a little bit faster than, just your average pile, so long as it's on a timer, as Jay and Polly Armour describe in the video that we did with them about their system. Again, I'll link that in the show notes. They are an organic farm and therefore have to meet the regulations like I did. So they pile horse manure, cow manure, and wood chips, which kind of all mix together, then turn on their blowers with the timer. They then keep records for 3 days, which is what the regulation is. You have to keep records for 3 days to say it met those temperatures, but leave it on for roughly a week, then turn it with some forks to ensure a balanced product. But that's not part of the regulation. And then after a total of about 15 days, again, also not part of the regulation, you only have to leave it for 3 days. They then remove the now organic compliant compost and are free to start another pile. That turn in the middle of the process is a great idea to just ensure you kill diseases and, kill the weed seed. Because what I found was that the piles tended to be somewhat unevenly decomposed if you just left them static, with the bottoms and sides getting less love. By love, I mean heat. Then the middle and the top. To me, the way Jay and Polly use their system is the way to use a system like this in general, especially if you are certified organic or really wish to sell any of the compost as organic compliant. So you make a batch, move it off to mature, and then start another batch immediately. You could do that indefinitely, and it would take 3 days to get a batch up to what would be considered NOP compliant. If I had a tractor with a front end loader plus access to unlimited manure, it would be a no-brainer for me to just bang out tons of organic compliant compost this way. And yes, we're no longer certifying our farm for reasons I discussed last week, but FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, requires the same regulations to be met. So it's for people that fall under the FSMA regulations, which you can look into that. It's mostly people who make over $25,000 a year on their produce. Anyway, the FSMA requires the same regulations to be met, so it's now essential to follow the same organic manure/compost standards if you're certifying or not. Anyway, I think the system I designed was okay, but the pipe would need to be more robust, like the perforated pipe, more like the Schedule 80 PVC that Jay and Polly describe using in that video, just so it holds up better under the temperatures and the weight. I also made my static aerated system wide, and I think making it long as opposed to wide would make more sense, or you're just, especially if you're using a tractor and a bucket, just to be able to get to it. If you do not have a tractor and a bucket, well, I would recommend just making the best small batch inoculating compost that you can, buying in bulk compost, because the amount of work is just too much to do by hand for any sane human. Yeah. I mean, you could still do a small scale sort of static aerated system like that if you needed to, especially if you're certifying organic or you fall under the FSMA regulations. But generally speaking, just do it by hand. You'll make a better compost and you'll spend less money on the structure. Or start a gym, and one of the pieces of equipment is just a compost pile and a shovel. That could work too. CrossFit farming, where they pay you to help make your compost and broad fork your beds. Why not? That's actually sounds like a plan. Anyway, I know that's not a perfect answer, but I hope that gives you some perspective on the static aerated compost system and where I stand with my own. Like, we'll still use it, but it's not like a big part of what we do. It's more just like now we have to meet the FSMA regulations. So yeah, let me know any other questions you all have. Up next, we'll take a quick break and then talk about stubborn cover crops. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Peaceful Heritage Nursery. If you're looking for hardy and resilient fruit trees, berry plants, or pawpaw trees, then check out Peaceful Heritage Nursery. Peaceful Heritage Nursery LLC is a mail-order nursery shipping premium quality fruit trees and berry plants across the USA. They specialize in resilient, non-GMO plant genetics for small growers. Their diverse selection includes berries, cold hardy figs, passion fruit, gumi, mulberry, and much more. They're famous for their diverse selection of premium quality grafted pawpaw trees. 5-star Google ratings and customer testimonials attest to their commitment to excellence in quality and service. Find them at peacefulheritage.com and join their mailing list. Once again, find them at peacefulheritage.com. Use the promo code NOTILL, all caps, one word, for 10% off your first order. All right, back to the show. All right, our last Patreon question of this Q&A day comes from Dan Gorman, who writes, quote, "I'm curious what techniques there are to manage a winter kill cover crop after an abnormally warm winter. I'm in Wisconsin, and generally this isn't a problem, but last winter my cover crop survived. Worried we're having a repeat of that this year," end quote. Okay, great. Great questions, and thanks, Dan. So I'm going to guess that, looking at Wisconsin's temperatures right now, it is -1 Fahrenheit in Madison as I get these notes together. I'm going to guess a warm winter and surviving cover crops is not going to be a concern this year now, but because it has been since 1976 that the United States has had a cooler than average year, meaning it has been hotter than average every year since then, cover crops that don't die will almost certainly be an issue for you again in the future. So in that spirit, here is how to think about cover crops that don't die. First, it starts with prevention. In other words, when it comes to cover crops, don't risk it. Only utilize cover crops in areas that you need them to die, that you are certain will die. Peas are a reliable winter kill cover crop for me, whereas things like oats and crimson clover are not here in Kentucky Zone 6B. In other words, we may not have a day in the winter that gets below 20 degrees. Though we usually do, we will always have a string of nights in the 20s, which will effectively terminate peas so long as they are tall and relatively mature. I know I've said this before, but if you plant winter kill stuff too late, it may not kill. Peas are a prime example. They die easy when tall, but are stubborn little nerds when they're babies. Also, summer cover crops, those all die really easily in most cold. Now, if something does not die that you expected to die, your no-till options are limited. A tarp will not work in the early spring. I'll repeat that. If someone's plan is to plant their ground in April or early May, a March and April tarping will not do the trick, especially in cooler climates. Florida, you stay out of this. For most of us, it is just too cool and cloudy for a tarp to be effective in early spring. So what I have done in the past when I need that space and can't just treat it like any other cover crop where I wait until May to kill it, is I will mow it really low one time, wait 1 week, and then mow it again. Finally, I'll rake that material off and then lightly power harrow that area down to about 2 inches, just enough to kind of kill off the stuff as best I can without affecting the rhizosphere. It's messy, it's imperfect, but it's better than tilling it all in and having to wait a couple weeks to a couple warm weeks to plant it. If you were just dealing with stubborn peas, a single mowing very low to the ground will do the trick in most cases. In other words, like peas will die pretty easy if they get a little bit tall and you mow them really low. Grains are just grasses, meaning they will not die as easily. Thus, the power harrowing is kind of a necessity in this. In fact, my buddy Lou Johns, whom you will remember from the Living Pathways Roundtable we did a couple years ago, told me he had plots where he would mow his rye early in the spring, not to kill it, but to get the regrowth and build soil, which I think is a really cool idea if you don't need that plot right away. Anyway, back to termination. You can mow the cover crops and cover them with compost, but in my experience, the grass will often come back through if the cover crop is not fully killed. That's kind of the gist of organic options, really, that are not just straight up mow it and till it. We will, of course, cover killing cover crops. That's a hard phrase to say, coming up soon as we start to do that on our own farm. But I just want to emphasize now for anyone heading into their fall down in the southern hemisphere, or for the rest of us who will be here in 6 or 7 months, if you want it to die, it's got to be killable in warmer than average winter, because by and large, that, looking at the data, is what the trend indicates that we can expect. Worst case scenario, you get a few extremely cold nights in a row and stuff also dies while you also freeze in your office like I am. It's a win-win. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and huge thanks to all of our Patreon members for your questions, and please don't let up on them. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers. Also shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at notillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-till-growers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or sign up in the month of January, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Christy and Boggs. Christy's story is, Christy was the drummer for a band, and they were playing in Chicago, a big venue. And they, and it was time for Christy's solo. And so, starts hitting the toms, the music sort of fades out, and Christy gets in the zone and is going and going and going, and then, goes to hit that final crash. And when Christy looks up, everybody's gone. Everybody had disappeared. There was nobody on the stage. There was nobody in the crowd. It was just Christy. And so the rest of the story is having to unravel what happened to them all. And I'll give you a hint. It isn't aliens. That would just be too easy. Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening and or watching. We will see you probably not tomorrow, but maybe. But definitely Friday. Anyway, see you Friday. Thanks, y'all. Bye.